And kudos to the author, to Glenn Sunshine, for noticing this.
So.
Hey guys, Joffrey the Giant. I have just the briefest of rambles about men and words. I've been reading 32 Christians Who Changed Their World by Glenn Sunshine. An absolute fantastic concept for a book. So these are lesser known saints who in their various fields of endeavor. A lot of Kuyperian language in the book without Kuyper ever being mentioned. So, explorers, warriors, politicians, educators, pastors, agriculturalists, etc. How they changed their world. What a great concept. Unfortunately, I can't wholeheartedly recommend it to you. His view of history is slightly apologetic to the modern Enlightenment view. And I don't think he really realizes it. Again, this is my perspective. But when I read him on history, generally, and even when he talks specifically, especially when he's talking about women, you can tell that there's just a lot of Enlightenment thinking in there with him. He is so I don't actually, I know his age, and I know he's a boomer, but I don't actually know how he was educated. But when I read him, he reads like a boomer who went to public school and thinks he's been red-pilled. But he's only purple-pilled. Anyway, a cool concept for a book, and a lot of good stuff in this. So something really struck me while reading that book. And I thought about it again today as I was listening to an audiobook of a favorite of mine, A Defense of Poesy. A Defense of Poesy by Philip Sidney, who was a great soldier, a great scientist. He and his sister versified a bunch of psalms. When I say soldier, fighting for Protestantism. And, this is a fascinating man. He did everything and sponsored everything. Right, the greatest alchemist of the age was, one of the people that he was patron to, and he was patron of the sciences, etc. Just an amazing man, young. He writes this defense of poesy, and he said, "I've sort of become a poet by accident." Right, and you can, as he writes, he actually starts the whole thing, telling the story of when he was visiting with an Italian soldier, and the Italian soldier talking about how being a soldier is the greatest calling that there is for a man. It's the highest thing that there is for a man. And, you can tell he's kind of sympathetic to that. And so he himself is a soldier. But he's become a poet, right? He's going to write this defense of poetry. And he does a beautiful and amazing job of describing basically how poetry is first and is last, but particularly that first, everything is built upon poetry. Go as far back, right? Find as primitive a culture as you want, right? It's always poetry at the base, and poetry is also what flowers. So just poetry up and down the whole thing. Then he says, he makes a case for how great historians are and how great philosophers are. So then he says, and one of the things he talks about with poetry that makes it so great is that it's one of the things it does well is mimesis. It imitates well, which, in this day and age, we don't consider imitation something to be lauded. So the philosopher, therefore, and the historian are they which would win the goal, the one by precept, that's the philosopher by precept, the other by example. That's the historian. But both, not having both, do both halt. So the philosopher has precept, the historian has example. And this is how they can achieve greatness and win the goal, but they need both. For the philosopher, setting down with thorny arguments the bare rule is so hard of utterance and so misty to be conceived, that one that hath no other guide but him shall wade in him until he be old, before he shall find sufficient cause to be honest. For his knowledge standeth so upon the abstract and general, that happy is that man who may understand him, and more happy that can apply what he doth understand. On the other side, the historian, wanting the precept, is so tied, not to what should be, but to what is, to the particular truth of things, and not to the general reason of things, that his example draweth no necessary consequence, and therefore a less fruitful doctrine. So the philosopher stuck in precept, the historian stuck in example. Elsewhere in this work, Sidney talks about how the historian is the tyrant of table talk. And I think we've all met that person, right? Usually it has more to do with politics and interpretation of politics and sort of historical dialectic, right? But is there anyone more? When I went to college, I was majoring in history. I love history. But is there anyone more tiresome than someone who looks at the entire world through the lens of history? Oof. Anywho, so precept, example. Poetry has both of those things. Now doth the peerless poet perform both? For whatsoever the philosopher saith should be done, he giveth a perfect picture of it, by someone by whom he presupposeth it was done, so as he coupleth the general notion with a particular example. A perfect picture, I say, for he yieldeth to the powers of the mind an image of that whereof the philosopher bestoweth but a wordish description. As poets make, and I think this is where he talks about how Socrates, no, not here. Yeah, so Socrates describes poetry as making an image with words. So the poet can say what the philosopher wants to say in an image with words. For he yieldeth to the powers of the mind an image of that whereof the philosopher bestoweth but a wordish description, which doth neither strike, pierce, nor possess the sight of the soul, so much as that other doth. Right? Usually definitions of poetry talk about experience and feeling and language that brings that out. I wouldn't agree with that definition, but that aspect of poetry is what's being highlighted here. You feel the poem. The philosopher doesn't hit you. Unless he has some remarkable moment of clarity, which has probably been produced by poetry. Because Philip Sidney talking about what poetry actually is really interesting. Because for him, like, it doesn't have to have verse to be poetry. Anyway. For as in outward things to a man that had never seen an elephant or a rhinoceros, who should tell him most exquisitely all their shape, color, bigness, and particular marks, or of a gorgeous palace an architect who, declaring the full beauties, might well make the hearer able to repeat, as it were by rote, all he had heard, yet should never satisfy his inward conceit with being witness to itself of a true living knowledge. But the same man, as soon as he might see those beasts well painted, or that house well in model, should straightway grow, without need of any description, to a judicial comprehending of them. So no doubt the philosopher with his learned definitions, be it of virtue or vices, matters of public policy or private government, replenisheth the memory with many infallible grounds of wisdom, which notwithstanding lie dark before the imaginative and judging power, if they be not illuminated or figured forth by the speaking picture of poesy. Reminder, we're going to come back to this, okay? All right. And he's going to go on, and I'm going to stop there. Okay, here we go. So here is Aristotle in Poetics. It is not by writing in verse or prose that the historian and poet are distinguished. The work of Herodotus might be versified, but it would still be a species of history, no less with meter than without. They are distinguished by this, that the one relates what has been and the other what might be. On this account poetry is more philosophical and a more excellent thing than history, for poetry is chiefly conversant about general truth, history about particular. In what manner, for example, any person of a particular character would speak or act, probably or necessarily, this is general, and this is the object of poetry, even while it makes use of particular names. But what Alcibiades did, or what happened to him, this is particular truth. All right. So, poetry, like what is poetry? That's something that I think is really hard to define. The simplest definition that I try to work with is elevated language. A lot of definitions include some sort of idea of concentration. Britannica.com, poetry is literature that evokes, so first of all, I already object to literature, right? Again, as I say, it's difficult to define. What I mean is there are many definitions, and that's why it's difficult to define. Poetry is literature that evokes a concentrated, imaginative awareness of experience or a specific emotional response through language, chosen and arranged for its meaning, sound, and rhythm. I think chosen and arranged for its meaning, sound, and rhythm is the most important part of it. Whether it's concentrated or whether it's elevated, there is something about how the language is presented that is both fundamental and exalted. Why am I bringing all this up? And this could be like a whole conversation, right? But why am I bringing all this up in regards to this? Something that struck me was how often, whether I was reading about a woman founding schools, or about a pastor marching out to face an army, or about a missionary getting on a ship, or about a prince learning to rule, I was really amazed at how often, and kudos to the author, to Glenn Sunshine, for noticing this. These were poets. So many poets pop up in here. And none of them are in here because of their work as poets. Sir Philip Sidney is probably best known as a poet these days. Well, let's actually see. Sir Philip Sidney, English poet and courtier, is what shows up first. Yeah. He was an English poet, courtier, scholar, and soldier who is remembered as one of the most prominent figures of the Elizabethan age. Right. The famous Renaissance man, right? Anyway, why does this make sense? As so many of these incredible, amazing, world-changing people were poets. How can you be great if you're not thoughtful about language? The peace of Christ be upon you.
What day is it today? Remind me.
It's Sunday, Mr. Pinch.
Sunday. And what do we do on a Sunday morning, wherever we happen to be? We go to church, you bloody heathen!